So, first question, could you state your name, your pronouns, degree, year, color, and slogan?
My name is Kay. My pronouns are they and them. My degree is International Business and Marketing in my third year, so a commerce degree. And my slogan is K for clubs, and color is yellow.
Okay, great. Could you state your campaign manager and your faction if you have one?
My campaign manager is Michael Grenier, and my faction is with INTERPOL.
Are you a current member of any political parties?
No.
And I guess changing tack a little bit, how would you characterize the role of the USU and the USU board?
I think the USU is very important towards student life because the board helps direct and plan all the events for the students on our community, and I think the USU really helps enhance the student experience overall.
What about the role of student unionism more broadly in the USU?
I think it's good that students can think independently and really strive for what they believe in, and I think it's good that a lot of students are really getting involved and putting themselves out there for the causes that they believe in.
Okay, cool. I'll pass on to Khan for the next section.
Yep. I guess in relation to that, what motivated you to run for the USU board?
So I'm in third year and it took me a while, but I realized that I really like getting involved with events and the student community, and I really like going out there to make friends and meet new people. And from hearing the experiences that my friends have had, some of them have been very isolative, especially with the pandemic over the past few years. So I wanted to do something for them as well as everyone else. So I decided to run for USU board because of that. And I think by doing that, I can really help make new friends, help others make friends, and see what I can do for others in order to help them have a similar good experience just as I have. And like over the past few years, because of the pandemic and of course certain world events, I think there has been a lot of negative stereotypes and connotations that have come up with certain groups, especially international students or maybe Chinese students such as myself, or like the Jewish community. And by sort of running for USU, I want to by doing this, I think that it really helps give me an opportunity to dispel those stereotypes and sort of showcase that those negative connotations aren't true, and that the students here at USID are just like you and me.
Alright, I guess now related to that as well, how would you describe your politics? And what is one political issue, or more, if you desire, that you are passionate about?
In terms of my policy or like in general?
More like politics. So how would you describe your politics first?
I would say I'm definitely a centrist, and I tend to vote independent because I believe in giving underdogs a chance, but that might be biased since I'm independent.
In terms of that more like independent, you said centrism. Given that we're, for example, I know that perhaps you're an international student, but if you have to pick like either party or candidate in the federal election coming up, who would you kind of identify with?
I guess it's a bit of a hard one, seeing as where I'm from, we tend to sort of change. So in like Canada, which is the country that I was born and came from, some people might vote liberal and some people might vote conservative, one after the other. It's not like you really stick with a certain party. So I guess I was leaning on the candidate with the best policies and like something that I would really believe in. So I think you mentioned what one political issue I have, one political issue that I really believe in, and I think that would probably be how people see newcomers and immigrants, because Canada is a country founded on immigration, and we really tend to welcome people who come here, and we have lots of refugees as well. So I think that it's important that Australia sort of welcomes people of color and foreigners into the country and accept them as our own, because I believe in inclusion.
Yeah, so that was actually quite interesting. You said you tend to vote on things that you deem as like the best policy.
Yes.
Let's say because you are from Canada, would you consider, for example, voting either for the Liberals or the Conservatives there? Will there be years, in other words, that you may consider voting Conservative?
Like in Canada or
in the Canadian Tories?
Perhaps. There's, I guess, a bit of both parties. It's very broad, and in Canada, voting isn't mandatory, but I do it, obviously. So, I think previously I also voted for an up-and-coming party that was more niche, and I guess if they had good policies, then I'm willing to give like any party a chance, because they also switch up regularly.
Yep. Now related that back to like the board, to what extent do you think the USU board should take a political stance? How would you approach working with fellow board members who are more activist oriented, for lack of a better word?
I think that's perfectly okay, and I'm willing to give everyone a chance, because I think teamwork is a vital part of being on the USU board, and we all have the same end goal, hopefully, which is to create a good experience and support students in our community. So I would be equally willing to be friends with and work with every one of the other candidates if I were to be elected.
That's quite interesting. Now, given that you did state that your campaign manager is Michael Grenier, who is an SRC representative since the last election, Grenier ran with a faction that's aligned with the Campus Liberal last year. Does this reflect your politics?
No, I'm independent, and I'm a part of INTERPOL, actually, which is an international student faction and social club, and we're more neutral in terms of that, where we don't align with real life politics, and our political sort of doings are strictly towards student politics and not in Australian or politics of any other country.
In relation to that, then, given that there is ongoing, for example, cuts in higher education in Australia, which rolls onto, for example, groups such as international students, do you imagine at the board taking a stance and willing to vote to put a public statement, for example, against the federal government's education cuts?
Yeah, I think it's like, it really sucks that that had to happen, and despite being a commerce student myself, I'm really passionate about the arts, and I'm an artist myself, digital media. But I hope that in the future that all the things that they sort of cut out, all the programs and courses are brought back, because a lot of them were very cultural oriented as well, and I think that's a really important aspect for students to be learning about.
You said earlier that your campaign manager, being Grenier, does not totally reflect your politics. Then how do you, I guess, reconcile that close association, regardless, with the campus liberals, if you are saying that you are more independent, apolitical? Are you then functionally an independent liberal candidate?
No. Sorry, what was that part about? I think I missed the part where you said something with G.
Are you functionally a liberal, a lib-dependent, so liberal independent?
No. Well, it's a funny story how Michael and I met, actually. We met in Mixoak, the Mixed Race and Mixed Culture Society. So in that club, there's actually a whole variety of us from like a lot of different backgrounds, and like we became friends through that. And he mentioned something about student politics, and I thought, hey, this is a good chance to sort of put myself out there and do something beyond the clubs that I'm in, since I'm club exec in several clubs, as people have probably seen from my social media and referenced several times. But that's sort of how we met, and I think despite his sort of political beliefs and mine, we both want to help other people and make the best experience for everyone, and I think that it's sort of less important in terms of what our politics are, and we're both independent and willing to help others. So I think that's sort of where we clicked, and yeah.
Could I just ask a follow-up to that as well? So, I mean, it seems like you and Michael Grenier have a lot of common interests. You have that mixed soc group as a shared sort of club society that you've been part of, so I'm just going to keep making sure this is on.
Yeah, sometimes.
So, but you're very clear that you differentiate from him in, I guess, being more independent.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like, I guess you can have different, like, factional alliances. But in terms of his politics, do you agree with any of them? And if so, which ones do you agree with? Which ones do you not agree with?
Well, I think what Michael's really good at is that he's good at including others and helping other people regardless of like politics and all of that, and he's also like independent as well. And I think that sorry, what was the question?
So which of his politics do you agree with, and which ones do you not agree with?
Right. So I think I sort of like his approach in that sense, and in terms of what I disagree with, I don't really think I like strictly disagree with him, and this is a very like neutral answer, I know, but I think that it's okay to have like different opinions or strong or weak opinions about certain things, and it's kind of what makes us who we are as people. And like I don't have very strong political opinions in terms of things that occur in life. I believe in like, you know, always being nice to others and human rights and rights for marginalized groups, obviously, but in terms of that, I'm not exactly sure where like what Michael's exact policies were when running, but I think a lot of them had to do with sort of what I was mentioning, and I believe he said something about like more welfare for international students, which I really like. So overall, he seems to have a very, I guess, what's it called? He seems to really advocate for student welfare in general. So, yeah.
You said you said I guess said that your partnership, for example, with like Grenier is through like supposedly your common desire for better student life and stuff. Can you cite any specific like action or records that Grenier have done in his capacity as SRC representative so far, given it's nearly is more than 6 months now in his role? Can you cite anything that have impressed you so far?
I think overall I'm really impressed by how he's not afraid to speak up, even if like people disagree with him, because I know like in this sort of political climate it might be a bit scary for some people, especially people who are like younger, to sort of really have a strong opinion or like voice something that they disagree with, and especially when there's like so many people and there's like 39 people in the SRC, so there's probably a really big meeting every time like that occurs. And I think I really admire his ability to stand for what he believes in, and lost my train of thought. To stand for what he believes in and just not back down, even when someone may disagree or someone may be like aggressive or that sort of thing.
Yep. Now pivoting to, I guess, a question about your commitment, because as a board director, if you are elected, you will be paid a stipend, and if you are an office bearer, one of the executive, you will be paid even higher. You currently serves, as we are aware, on the execs of at least 4 societies, the United Nations, modern United Nations of Sons, SUTEC, MIXOC that you mentioned, and you also recently got approved for your Dark Academic Society. Given that you're exec 4 societies, and if you are elected, you will commence board director term in a month. How do you imagine your time commitments to your duties as a board director?
I mean, from my understanding, it's that if you do become a board director, then you can't really be an executive of a club. So I would be unfortunately leaving those positions if I were to be elected. So I would maybe sort of gradually phase out all the tasks that I currently have and do an executive handover to whoever fulfills those roles afterwards, and I would focus on being a board director, as that's what I'm currently striving for.
So I guess then when you said handover, when you said gradually, do you mean you still kind of like stay there in the bid and then hand over, or like quit immediately after and let the society figure things out themselves?
I mean, I did tell everyone in advance, hey, I might not be here next semester because of personal commitments. So, like, my friends understand, and they're, like, really sweet as well. So, we've sort of been doing that already, where we look for someone else who can do, like, marketing, for example. And, like, I'm showing whoever's in charge, or whoever might be in charge in the future, like, oh, this is the program I use, and this is this process. So if I were to be elected, I think that my clubs would be in a pretty good position from, like, the ones that I left to for whoever it was that I've been sort of talking to take over my current duties.
Yep. Now you framed yourself as a representative for international students, given that you
Yes.
are one. What do you think are the most important issues facing international students? Can you identify a few issues and then expand on what is with those areas?
Well, one of the main ones that I've had a lot of friends speak to me about is discrimination as an international student, or like just a minority in general, because like there's a lot of people out there in this world, obviously, and they may not be aware of like things that they say or certain stereotypes. And like when my friends go out there into the real world off of campus, they sort of face this sort of discrimination or harassment. So I think that's a really big one, where international students are often treated differently, or like they're exploited because of their status. And another thing that happens is that sometimes they're exploited for work and have their documents withheld. And being new to the country, or maybe speaking English as a second language, it might be sort of more scary for them to stand up for that and say, hey, these aren't like fair work practices. So I think those are two of the main issues that international students face that I would like to help like decrease, or do what I can to help with. And I think another one is sort of fitting in and making friends, because a lot of international students come from like a different culture, and when they come here, there might be a cultural shock where they don't really understand references, or they don't like really get what the events are, because it's not something we do back home. So I think that like one of the reasons why I'm doing this is to help international students make friends and like build a bridge between different communities, so that domestic students and internationals can really mix up and get to know one another.
I guess now tying that to student welfare, since you have so far primarily focused on cultural perception and then discrimination against international students, can you identify issues other than that you mentioned, fair work, that concretely affects international students, things that domestic students enjoy, that international student don't?
So, like, international students have work visas, and there's like different types, obviously, and like a lot of workplaces require Australian citizenship to work, and that sort of bars out international students, even if those are just like casual positions that have maybe higher turnover rates. And I think that people who are Australian, like myself as well, we have more stability in that we get more benefits and we're eligible for superannuation and like some jobs depending on what it is. But international students, since they're not citizens, they don't really receive those benefits sometimes unless they work like a full-time job maybe, but it depends on like the workplace, obviously. But I think like those factors make it harder for students to have more stable income or maybe like stay here if they wish to do so after uni.
I wanted to ask a question because you did mention the visas and unique problems that international students face. Recently, there was a law change that Honi reported on that requires, the change is that postgraduate international students will be required to gain approval from the minister, or from the defence minister, or the home affairs minister, sorry, before they transfer the degree. I wanted to ask what your opinions on that were, like what is your understanding of that issue, and if you were elected as board director, what would you do to support postgraduate international students who might be facing that issue?
I think it's like I did read that article actually, and I think it's unfair to sort of have a very broad umbrella policy based on the actions of a few people who like obviously don't define international students as a whole. And like it causes a hardship where if like an international postgrad, just like any other person, if they want to change programs, then that just makes it a barrier to do that. And there's been like a lot of, with COVID and like having online classes and everything, there's already a lot of like isolation and like mental health issues of like a lack of productivity and whatnot. So I think that really sort of doesn't help the case in terms of that. And if I were elected, then I would first of all make a statement on that and encourage all postgrads to really choose carefully, because obviously it's already been done. And if anything, I would try to see what my abilities are and like what my outreach has, and if anyone's willing to be on board to sort of see if we can do something that alleviates that or decreases the effects of that decision.
Yeah. Now related to that, since you focus on student welfare in your policy statement, can you nominate specific policies that you would like to pursue for student welfare? For example, to an international student, that since you said you will be a representative for the community, can you list out a number of policies you would want to enact to help with student welfare if you're a
So one of the things I mentioned earlier was mental health, and I think socialization is a really important aspect of maintaining good mental health, because as humans we need like connection with other people, for most people anyways. So there's a lot of students still studying remotely, whether due to being overseas or maybe even like domestic students who are here who can't travel or have other commitments or maybe are immunocompromised. So I think that for more socialization opportunities, one of my policies would be to have one-on-one participation and one-on-one events, because in like a Zoom call you can't really, like, you can only do so much. So I think by having that connection with other people, that would really increase mental health and like the welfare of students in that aspect.
Yep. Since you emphasize so strongly on mental health care, do you see any structural factors, not just say for example that contributes to often what you characterize as like worse mental health care and worse mental health for international students? What structural factors do you identify as being responsible for that for international students?
I think aside from the whole online class sort of thing, being away from home and living in a culture that might be similar or completely different to their own, and like for most international students, their family and close friends are overseas, at least when they first come. So I think just that feeling of isolation, of being alone in a new country, which I will admit I sort of faced when I first came, it's sort of like deteriorating when you realize that, oh, like there's all these people in this new culture and I don't really like, have the same knowledge or interests as they do, and you're sort of like surrounded by people, but yet like you're alone in terms of your own little bubble when you first come.
You referenced just then like a need for more like one-on-one online socializing. Can you expand on this a bit more? Like, what does it particularly mean, and how will you like implement this policy as a board director? Just like, what do you mean by like that one-on-one online socializing? Who with who, for example?
So, for example, there's online meet and greets or online speed friending events that I've often seen and have participated in. And what it involves is a lot of people logging into a Zoom call, and there's maybe say 20 people, for example, in the Zoom call, and everyone makes an introduction and talks briefly about themselves. But then because there's 20 people, it's a little hard for each person to sort of talk after their initial introduction because of the number of people or maybe the connection, and it's just harder to talk online. So for those who might be introverted or more quiet, like just having that sort of event wouldn't really be beneficial as if there were like a real life speed friending event where you were actually matched up with someone and you got to talk and get to know them better, rather than just having an initial introduction, having like one or two people talk and the rest listening. So I think if I were to implement that, I would sort of put people in breakout rooms, just like the classes, I know, but I would sort of post like topics or like maybe match people with things that they have in common. And I've actually tried this once in real life with INTERPOL, where I match people for a speed friending event based on their interests. So that way, if this were done online and there was, say, 2 or 3 people in a breakout room, students would have something to talk about and they would get more engagement and more interaction rather than the whole lecture style Zoom call where everyone's in one room, if that makes sense.
Yep. I guess in many ways, because during lockdown, as I am aware, as we were aware, the USU was forced to have, for example, online events, for example, USU online day trips, etc., including speed friending. These offerings seems to still be ongoing, is still a feature of the university at the moment as well. Do you think that this policy is not? It seems that these policies distinguishable from those. Seems identical. Is this anything new? Like this one-on-one online socializing and speed friending new, or they a repetition of what's already going on?
I think there may be an expansion and more improved version of what the like offerings are already available, because like as someone who's like very extroverted and social, sometimes I'll like talk to people like on Messenger one-on-one and they tell me, oh, I haven't really talked to anyone for a few months because like I've went to online events, but it's more of an introduction and more passive. Like for example, where in a tour you'd have a tour guide and you'd maybe say your name and program and you'd sort of just watch a tour of wherever together. So I think like by asking the people what they want and like how they would like to see online events improved is what I'm sort of thinking of and like talking about in my implementation of further interaction through one-on-one events online.
Right. I wanted to ask a follow-up to that as well. So you've spoken extensively about Zoom one-on-one consultations, breakout rooms, etc. Firstly, I guess since it does seem very similar to what the USU is already doing, what do you think is the main limitation of, like, I guess, the programs that the USU have already implemented to engage international students in that way? And secondly, do you have any other policies that kind of sort of aim to engage offshore international students beyond just Zoom? Like, what are the other options there?
Oh yeah. In terms of like limitations of online events, I think another one would definitely be that I've noticed there's certain events that sort of are really highly advertised, such as like parties or etc., but there's like also smaller events that are less known and maybe only advertised through email. And there was this one time where I was at a meeting with some of my friends and we were all studying and in a room, and someone came up to us and asked if there was like this and this event here, and he showed me the ad for it and it had said that it was in that room, but like there was no one else but us, obviously. So then he told me later that it turns out they had sort of changed the location, but it was a very like low-key change that happened only like an hour prior, so it wasn't like an event that really was overly emphasized. And I think that like the USU could maybe promote their events more, and like even the smaller events, and maybe on more platforms as well, because like the majority of things are posted on Instagram and like Facebook, and obviously there's only so much you can post because you can't be online all day and advertising every event. But I think it would be good to sort of maybe implement and create more awareness towards smaller events through things other than email. And in terms of my policies, I think that having more in-person events would be good for international students and domestic students to sort of get to know one another, because there's some international events at the moment, but it seems like it's advertised to like sort of to attract more international students in general and not domestic students. And I think that by having more events that incorporate both sides, both internationals and domestics together, it sort of creates a higher sense of community where students socialize with one another and not just the internationals in their own group, which is like one of those negative connotations that some people may have.
Sure thing. I wanted to ask about some of your policy on increasing recreational sports. The USU already does a lot of interfaculty events, especially like sports events. For that, there's also lots of clubs and societies that do recreational sports. My question is, what do you think are the limitations here? Like, why do you see a need to increase recreational sports? And secondly, what exactly do you plan to do to achieve that?
I think like as a marketing student maybe, that a lot of the times like the ads that I see online for like sports make it seem like it's more serious, or maybe it's for people who are like experienced. So like one thing that Mixoc has done is have more recreational sports events. So like recently we had a dodgeball event, and we sort of just advertised it using more fun colors and like to members, and we told everyone, hey, beginners are welcome, it's just for fun. And like I think that sort of differentiates between like maybe pictures of people in like volleyball gear, and even if it's like, I don't know if that was actually an event, but even if it's like just for fun, it makes it seem like it's more directed towards people who are already experienced in sports or very active in that.
I guess tying into that, it seems that so far you've identified, for example, the one-on-one socializing, and then with recreational sports, you took issue, for example, with like the design of like some of those like marketing ads. Is it true to say that the main one, like the primary barriers that you identify with the USU delivering these is communications and marketing?
Yeah, that's like, I think obviously it's with such a big university and so many things going on, it's hard to include everything, and like you'd be posting several times daily probably, and that's a hard thing to do as someone who does marketing for some of my clubs. But I think there could be better communication in that maybe multiple people could run certain accounts, and there could be more like awareness brought. Sorry, I lost my train of thought again. And that there could be more awareness brought for events and whatnot. And yeah, sometimes when I look at the USU page, I see events that are sort of vaguely mentioned with a picture, and it does look nice, obviously, but as someone who would maybe be a new student, or maybe if my first language wasn't English, I wouldn't really have that many details of what's happening. If there was just one or two sentences and the picture and maybe a link to sign up, I'd want maybe a bit more info, a bit more description on what it is, and if everyone's welcome, or no experience needed, that type of thing.
Yep.
Do you have a question, or can I ask a question?
Hmm?
Or do you want to move on to this section? I just wanted to ask a couple more about.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so you also mentioned something about in your policy, things about making drink prices more affordable, and really encouraging parties and socials and more of that aspect of campus life. At the beginning of the year, the USU did implement a new policy where clubs and societies were unable to advertise free drinks with their Welcome Week events. I wanted to ask what you thought about this policy, and if you were elected, how would you go about, making this, actually implementing this, making drinks more affordable, lowering drink prices, and whatnot.
I personally think that if I were elected, then I'd try my best to do that, and I think a lot of USU events could maybe include drinks as a part of the initial ticket fee, or maybe give them out to people. And obviously I know that the money has to come from somewhere, but I think it would be good to do that for students, because a lot of students do drink, and we're all adults and everything, and I think that there's also, aside from cultural barriers, there's also financial barriers for some students, and that not everyone may want to apply for I know there's things where you can apply for a free ticket, but not everyone may want to do that, especially if their situation isn't something they'd really want to discuss even to an exec of a club. So I think by sort of having more affordable drinks, that would remove that barrier and issue of people having to ask or not being able to afford a drink if they're going out.
Okay, sure. I want to move on to finances and budget. So you in your quiz, you weren't able to answer the question about what VSU is, which is primarily how it relates to how the USU is funded. So basically, the USU is funded from student money and the government. Given the fact that your quiz results show, a lack in this pretty crucial piece of information relating to student funding, of USU funding, how will students be confident that you are able to navigate the complexities of USU finances, especially given that it's a multi-million-dollar organization?
I think in terms of that, I would want to maybe inform myself more of the different funding and etc. that the USU has to offer, and I know the basics of where the student fees and everything come from, but I would say that if I were elected, I would maybe have a talk with the financial committee, and I know that they recently sort of said they would do an investment review and everything, so I would try to inform myself more of this topic. And as someone who doesn't really deal with funding in clubs, because I'm not the treasurer in any of them, I would say that maybe I didn't have as much experience in terms of that sort of paperwork and allocating where what goes. But if I were to be elected, I would, knowing that that's a part of my job and it's something I should be knowing, I would do more to learn about that and be more informed of these sorts of things.
So you did mention just then that the USU is currently reviewing its investment portfolio, and Honi did report on that yesterday. We published an article about it recently. I just wanted to ask, what are you aware of at the moment with the USU's investment portfolio?
I mean, like, based on that article, I know it's sort of like a gray area, and that it's sometimes hard to sort of differentiate like what you should be thinking about these things, because like I guess the university does need money to pay like all the wages and support all these clubs and groups of people and sort of do what it does. So
Yes. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But I guess based on like what the USU's current investment portfolio is, what do you identify are the key issues with the USU's current investment portfolio?
I guess it could be maybe more environmentally inclined, and that there could be more investments towards like companies that are more green, I want to say.
Yep. So what's the issue, I guess, in your view, with like, I guess the companies that the USU is currently has these investment deals with?
I mean, I guess they did have to invest in something in the end, and sometimes like you do have to sort of, what's it called? There's a word for this. You sort of have to like pick something, even if it doesn't align with like your values, or maybe it might not be the most popular choice. And I think that's like a really hard decision, that they had to invest and everything, but it was for like the better, where they would receive returns in order to support and keep going. So I think like it was probably a hard choice, but they had to do it.
Right. So there's lots of conversations going on at the moment about whether the USU should divest from those companies. What are your opinions on that? Do you think that the USU should be divesting from those companies?
I think that if they can find an alternative source, then yes. But like I know with the pandemic and everything, things have probably been hard, and like the USU and like companies in general sort of need the money to keep going, and especially to keep people employed and keep paying them. And I think that's an important part of our economy, where like people are able to keep their jobs, or at least remain employed during this pandemic.
Right. So if you were elected and you were given the opportunity to divest from these companies that the USU is currently involved with, I mean, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it kind of sounds like I'm hearing that you're hesitant to vote in favor of divesting from these companies.
Like, it depends. Like I mentioned, if there was an alternative that was found, then yes. But like I wouldn't say like divest and block it all at once, because like it could affect people's jobs and livelihoods and everything, and like there would be like people and like staff members that would be affected by this decision, probably, if it sort of just happened super fast.
I guess in relation to that, since I assume that you did read the article, the USU board in fact voted in favor of divestment 2 years ago. The more pertinent question at that point, since you pointed out that your decision, so to speak, is contingent on a review finding alternatives, will you because there's a lack of action so far, what would you as a USU board director do to ensure, say, that that's what divestment actually happen?
I would say that, I guess like from my experiences, a lot of the times when things don't happen, aside from that, they're like probably, there's a lot of discussion and you have to think about it and whatnot. Like people don't like check in on things, so it's sort of a waiting game sometimes, if you're like, oh, we're waiting for that email reply for a certain thing. So like if I were to take like any sort of action, like even in general as a board director, I would check up on things regularly and see how it's going, and if there was, say, like a dead end of any sort, I would sort of see what I can do to go around that, or I would ask my peers for advice and see what they would do rather than just, keeping it on hold.
I guess then that encapsulate, I guess, are you saying that you only consider voting in favor, say, of divestment, if and only if the USU managed to find other ways of investing when the USU board, as a prospective board directors, you guys are board directors are able to vote on who to divest to. So in other words, it's always like a chicken and egg question. Do you consider it impossible to vote in favor of divestment and then finding alternatives in order for divestment? Do you find that impossible?
Not in particular. I think it really depends, because as we've seen from the arts cuts recently, it would be terrible if anything else, such as clubs or maybe other programs or venues that the USU hosts, were cut because of financial decisions, which has a lot to do with the USU board. So something I like to do is to do the math for certain things to see, is this a viable plan for my budget and etc., or my household expenses. So I would talk to whoever's doing or making financial decisions or keeping records of that to see if there's, if it's a viable decision and if anything would be drastically cut as a result of that decision.
Right. So you did mention the arts cuts just then.
Yes.
And sort of related to that is that whole topic of the role that student activism plays in being a board director for the USU. Your quiz results also show kind of a lack of, or a gap in your knowledge about the operations of student activism more generally. So is this an indication that you see the USU primarily as a vehicle through which student parties occur, rather than activism?
Political parties or
No, as in
parties?
Yeah, based on your policies, you did have a lot of focus on parties, affordable drinks, etc. But you weren't really able to talk about operations of student activism. So I guess the question here, to kind of narrow it down, what role do you think student activism plays in being a USU board director?
I think that it's good if board directors want to get involved and for whatever it is that they're fighting for, and I don't think it's necessarily all fun and games. Obviously, I know there's work such as different committees and portfolios that are involved, and that there are a lot of real world issues that do occur for the USU. So sorry, what was the question?
Yes, so how, I guess...
Oh, right, how does
student
activism
activism
play a part?
Yeah.
I think having the USU board, we're sort of more prominent figures within the USID community, and we have a lot of outreach, and we have our leadership abilities. So I think it's good for people who are leaders of the community to sort of speak up against something, because it brings awareness towards that. And I think that USU board directors and people in general, if they're not anxious about it, should be speaking up on that and supporting reviews and committees that have to do with things that marginalized groups face.
Okay, sure. Are you happy to wrap that one? Okay, yeah.
Another question, this is going on to a different topic, I suppose. In what way, or if any, do marginalized student communities such as disabled students benefit on having you on a USU board?
I've sort of heard that like the disabled community has been looking for their own space within campus, and I think that's like it's been a really long time since they've been fighting for that. And I think people with disabilities should have more like say in a lot of things, because especially for those with physical disabilities, like campus is like a big space, and like a lot of the buildings are really small and really cramped, and like they should have a space where they can feel safe and face no judgment or like any side glances, which like is a thing, as I've heard from my friends who are disabled. And like I think it's important for like that community, just like the queer community or women's community, to have their own place and have a larger voice. So if I were to be elected, I would sort of consult people with disabilities who would like a say in these things, what they want to see more of, and what I can do to help as someone who's able-bodied myself. And I would use my voice to amplify theirs.
Yep. I guess given that the USU Grid article have not had a great track record of timely delivery of these promises, why do you think these efforts failed? One, and two, what will be different under you?
I think that like people living with disability isn't something that's like often talked about or like thought about sometimes, like not by everyone obviously, but like a lot of the times it's sort of pushed aside or maybe like procrastinated, or there's a lot of discussion that sort of like there's a hype for something and then it just dies out eventually as the slope falls. And I would continue on fighting for that cause and sort of not letting the engagement burn out after getting attention and support for it.
Yeah, okay. So just to wrap up the interview, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Well, let me find it. Who are two candidates that you would most like to work with on board? And then conversely, who are the candidates that you would least like to work with?
Do I have to choose two, or can I?
Yeah, two would be a good number.
I guess if I would want to work with everyone first of all, but if I really like had to choose, maybe like some of the independents, as an independent myself. So if we were to work together, maybe we wouldn't be independent, quote unquote, anymore.
Yep,
Sorry, that's a bad pun.
Could you name who the independent candidates you're considering are?
Oh, I met Naz online, and she seems really nice and super sweet, and she's also a club exec. And I heard Aiden's also independent, so I think it's just the three of us that are independent. So
Right.
yeah.
Any candidates that you don't really want to work with?
Like I honestly can't pick someone that I don't like, because I think that like none of them have proven otherwise to be anything than like hardworking and dedicated to the cause, and it would be unfair to judge them based on whatever preconceived ideas or like relationships they have with other people that I haven't personally experienced.
Have you organized any, just out of curiosity, have you organized any preference deals with any of the other candidates so far?
Nope.
Are you considering doing preference deals?
Possibly.
Could you tell us who you're considering doing preference deals with?
Maybe it's a hard choice, I guess. It really depends on, I haven't really talked to anyone in like full extent, so I'd have to sort of get a feel for it and see, do their policies and like beliefs sort of align with mine, and like how sort of compatible are those preference deals and like with the two of us. And being independent, I guess it like, and not politically involved in real life, it makes things easier, but it's hard to say really at this point.
Okay. Who would you vote for to be board president in the executive elections if you were elected?
I guess whoever has the best pitch, which I assume they will do before elections.
Sure. And in one sentence, why should students vote for you over any other candidate?
Let me think. I'm trying to think of something good. because I promise to try my best to give the USU community the best experience that they can get.
Okay, great. That wraps up the interview. Did you want to make any final closing statements, or as we can end it here properly?
Maybe as a closing statement, thank you for the interview, and I'm really glad to be having this opportunity to help out the student community, whether I'm elected or not.